Welcome back to Homesteading with the Zimmermans, where each week we give you another episode of what's happening here on our Northeast Iowa 21-acre homestead. My husband Alvin and I have been married for 25 years, and we have 7 children. 5 of those children still live at home. Our oldest 2 are married and no longer live at home, so this means we also have 2 son-in-laws and 1 grandson so far. So on our 21-acre homestead, we seek to preserve the self-sufficient lifestyle of our Old Order Mennonite heritage for the next generation. We involve the children in every aspect of the homestead, from raising and harvesting our own meat, gardening and preserving to fill the family's larder, or preserving the dairy from the family milk cows, plus all the many other skills that develop the character and integrity and relationships of a family that seeks to bring glory and honor to their Heavenly Father. Good morning, friends. Welcome back to a Saturday episode of Homesteading with the Zimmermans. In case you missed it in previous videos, we are now also making a Wednesday video. So you can go back and find those in our recently released videos. But in today's video, I'm going to be taking you along on our journey from gathering the sap and turning it into maple syrup that the family will use throughout the next year. So a couple things to remember is this maple syrup is just for home use. So we're okay with a little bit of sugar sand in the bottom, and we're not professionals. But anyway, I'll take you along on the journey and explain what we're doing as we go. So we tapped our trees about a month ago. You need a drill bit and a drill. You need a bit that's the same size as the taps you're using. Because we are beginners, we have a couple different size taps that we're trying out. We're not sure which ones we like best yet. And then you drill a hole in the tree about 1.5 inches deep, and you angle it slightly upwards. And then we tap our taps into the tree, and we attach some tubing that runs down into 5-gallon buckets. And in the lids of those 5-gallon buckets, we have drilled holes that are the same size as the tubing. Now, people that have more experience have told me that they drill their holes in the top of the bucket, on the side of the bucket instead of the lid, because that way if you get snow and rain, it doesn't drip down into the maple syrup. But when I suggested this to Elvin, he said it makes more sense to drill it into the lid, and that he made the holes so that they fit fairly tight, and not a lot of rain or snow or dirt should fit into those holes after the tubes are in. And he said this way the bucket isn't ruined, and we can still use the bucket for other things if we need to. So even though a few of the trees were dripping when we tapped a month ago, I think as we gain more experience, we will wait longer to tap, because it really took about 2 weeks for us to really start collecting anything that made it worthwhile for us to start cooking. So one of the things that I believe we learned this year is that the sap doesn't really start flowing until the ground is thawed, and maybe the trees are thawed. And because we had such cold weather just, a month or 2 weeks before we put our first taps in, like 30 below, it really is going to take a while for things to wake up from 30 below zero. But eventually we did start gathering buckets and buckets full of sap. And before we knew it, we had 100 gallons of sap and needed to start boiling. So sap does need to be kept cold because it has a sugar content. It will spoil if it's not refrigerated. But because we don't have refrigerator space to keep all of this sap cold, we just park this truck. I like to call it the sugar wagon. But really it's just this tank that we keep on the back of the truck, and then we park it on the north side of the garage, where the sun doesn't shine on it. It stays in the shade. And then as long as nights As long as a few nights out of the week we're getting temperatures that go below freezing, it chills it enough that it won't spoil. Now, the one thing that does happen is the longer you wait to boil the sap and turn it into maple syrup, the more the bacteria develops. And what happens is when you boil older sap, you're going to get a darker maple syrup with a more full flavor. And like I said, that doesn't really matter to us. We boil the sap, and whatever we get is what we get. Because when you boil it into maple syrup, you're pasteurizing it, so you don't ever worry about the bacteria. But because it has sugar content, the bacteria does ferment a little bit. And I always, if I know that my sap is about a week old, or close to a week old, I'll always taste it. And as long as it doesn't taste sour, as long as it still has a sweet taste, I call it good. And honestly, with this method of just parking it up here in the shade, we've never spoiled a batch of maple syrup or a batch of sap. So because we wanted to make minimal investment when we first started developing this skill of tapping trees and turning sap into maple syrup, we decided to use our Camp Chef, our propane Camp Chef that we already had, and just buy this evaporator that fits on top of it. And this way, if in the future we decide to, use a wood fire, instead of our propane burner, we can still use this same evaporator. So this evaporator does have a warming pan on top, but because the propane burners don't get as hot as a wood fire does, I don't feel like the warming pan really heats up the sap well enough. And this is why I use my big cheese pot, and I bring a 3-gallon batch to boiling on my stovetop, and then I add it to the evaporator, and it doesn't slow down and decrease the momentum of boiling that I have gathered in the evaporator. And I will link this evaporator in the description for you. And as unusual as it may seem to some of you, March snowstorms are actually fairly common here in our area. And just some stats for you. This year we have tapped about 10 trees, and we have a total of about 25 taps amongst those 10 trees. So then as the sap in the evaporator boils down to less than half full, I just bring another pot full of sap to boiling on my stovetop and add it to the boiling sap. And in doing it in this way is a very hands-off way. It's a very passive way of turning sap into maple syrup. And then I just keep track with tally marks how many gallons I've added. And when I know that I've added between 40 and 50 gallons of sap, then I stop adding fresh sap and just continue to evaporate the sap that I've added. So it takes about 12 hours for me to boil 40 gallons of sap down so that it fits into this 25-gallon evaporator. So what that means is what you saw us do so far is, we start with about 10 gallons, boil that down, add another 10 gallons, boil that down. So that usually takes me about 12 hours or one day. And then I turn it all off overnight. And then the next morning, I turn everything back on. And then day 2 is just taking all of that syrup and taking all of that sap and finishing it to the point where it becomes maple syrup. And like I said, that this is more of a long process. It takes a lot longer than it would with a wood fire, but it's also much easier to learn with if you're a beginner because the sap doesn't change as fast. So how to know when your syrup is finished? I'm going to tell you how I've learned to tell when my syrup is finished and what I do. So when your syrup reaches boiling, at what temperature it reaches boiling point is going to depend on your altitude. So the easiest way to learn is to keep a thermometer in it. And my syrup, because we're at like 1,200 feet elevation, 210 is boiling here in our area. So at 210 degrees, my syrup will be boiling. And what you want, a finished product, the easiest way to know is 7 to 7.5 degrees above boiling is when your sap is officially going to be syrup. Now there's a lot of scientific information out there, and I found for myself it was overwhelming. So I just had to learn by doing. So what I do is when my syrup reaches about 214, 213, 213 degrees Fahrenheit, 214 degrees Fahrenheit, I will tap it out of my evaporator. I run it through my strainer, and I just use the same strainer that I use to strain my milk. And I use the same straining material that I use to strain my milk. And it's just a very thin piece of cheesecloth, and I fold it up a couple times to make sure that it's catching all the dirt. So because maple sap contains a lot of minerals, there's something else that you will find in your syrup that's called niter. And niter is really just these minerals that have crystallized, and at 212, 13, 14 degrees, niter is actually still liquid and will go through any filter. So I've done the first straining of my sap right out of the evaporator and back into my cheese pot. And now I'm just going to finish boiling it here in the cheese pot. And I do think as I gain more experience, I will probably become more comfortable finishing it, in the evaporator. But it finishes so much faster when it is in a large flat bottom pan than it does in a pot. And because I'm still learning, I like to watch the bubbles, watch the temperature, and I like for it to go slower so that I can learn without making too many mistakes or ruining too many batches. It's also a really good idea to have more than one thermometer and just check where they're at so that you fully understand how the one that you're reading is measuring. I know that my orange one, my favorite one, reads a little cooler than the instant read thermometer. So I do keep that in mind. So now, because I know that 210 is boiling, I'll also know that 217 is likely when my syrup is going to be done, even though online it will say 219. But 219 is done only if 212 is your boiling point. So you can tell a lot by how close your syrup is getting done by just studying the bubbles. And as the season progresses and, I do more batches back to back, I almost depend more on the foam and the bubbles to let me know when the syrup is done than I do on the thermometer. But that's something that experience can teach you. What you hunting? What are you hunting? So here you can tell why it's important to have a tall pot when you're finishing your maple syrup, because it really does boil up quite a bit, just as it is about done. And you can see how the bubbles get bigger and slower the closer this maple syrup gets to being done. And you can stir the bubbles down, or you can just remove it from the heat a little bit. and either way works. So just don't be so afraid of making a mistake that you don't try at all. When my syrup is consistently staying at 217.5 degrees, which remember, this is 7.5 degrees over boiling point. And the reason it gets hotter than boiling point is because of the sugar content, because sugar gets hotter than water. So then I will bring it in and I will strain it. Now, a lot of people will use special straining cloths that are made just for maple syrup, and they will let their syrup cool down to about 185, 190 degrees before they strain it. And the reason they do this is that niter, that crystallized minerals, are liquid at 217 or over boiling point, and they will go through your straining cloth. But I have found that to be so troublesome. I can't get it to go through the strainer once the syrup cools down a little bit. So I don't even worry about it, and I just strain it when it is hot, because that's how it best goes through my strainer. And then what happens is, as the syrup cools, this niter, or another name for it is sugar sand, will settle to the bottom of my jar. Okay, I'll tell you a little more about the sugar sand a little later, but I wanted to show you how we preserve the maple syrup. So the hot syrup in the jar and a hot lid, and then we turn the ring on, and as the syrup cools, it will create a vacuum. And that vacuum, and along with the warm rubber on the lid, will create a seal, and that's how the maple syrup is preserved for a year or more. Okay, so here in my filter, you can see that we've collected some niter or sugar sand, but a lot of it I know went into my jar. And we know as a family that sugar sand or niter that settles to the bottom of the jar isn't harmful. We know exactly what it is, and we're not, making maple syrup to sell. We know that homemade maple syrup is just going to be a little different than what you would get from somebody that does this professionally or to make a living. And so then what we do with our maple syrup is we use all of the maple syrup except like the bottom 1 inch or less of the jar where all the sugar sand or niter has settled. And then I just use that in cooking or, somewhere where it's not as visible or as noticeable. But we know that the niter is not harmful. So that's why we don't really care if it's in our maple syrup. Another way that you can test to see if your maple syrup is done is you can put a plate or something in the freezer and then drip some maple syrup on it to cool it real fast, and then you can see if your syrup is thick enough. And if it pulls a string like this when it's chilled on the plate, you definitely know it's done. Now what will happen if your syrup is not done is there will be too much water content in it and it will spoil faster. So if you do cook batches that you were afraid were not quite done or had too much water left in it, just mark those and use them first. There's really nothing wrong with them except they won't keep as long. So I often have a little bit of maple syrup left over that doesn't fit into my jars. So we like to make infused maple syrups with those. Here I am making a cinnamon infused maple syrup, and we also like to make vanilla. And then because these small bottles aren't sealed, we will just store them in the back of the refrigerator for about 3 months, and then they will be perfect for using to sweeten our coffees. Okay, friends, we're almost to the end of this video. Just a couple other quick things I wanted to point out is The different grades of maple syrup don't really mean anything to us. Like I said, it's just for home use. We're not selling it. But you will notice that some maple syrup, all of ours is pretty dark, right? And part of that reason is our syrup sits for a couple days before we cook it, just because we don't gather that much at a time. We wait till we have enough to start cooking it. And because our process is slower, like when you cook it over a wood fire, or you have a more professional system, the process is faster, and the faster the process is, the lighter the syrup is. So most of our syrup is pretty dark and full flavored, but like I said, we don't mind. That's just the thing with homemade things versus professionally made things. You're gonna have a lot of variation. And it's not real sunny out today. I was hoping I can show you the niter in the bottom of the jars. Here you can see a little bit. That is all sugar sand, and that's just what I'll use for cooking. The bottom half of the jar, it settles. Those are the crystallized minerals. It really doesn't hurt anything. So when I'll remove these lids, remove the rings, the lids are sealed, and this is going to store well. We have 4 gallons so far. Our goal is about 6 to 8 gallons to get us through a year. And you might think, well, what do you use all that maple syrup for? And the truth is, we had to learn to use it more, because when you're buying a gallon of maple syrup at a time and it's $60 to $80 a gallon, you're going to use it sparingly, right? Because it's expensive. So we've learned to use it to sweeten a lot. We use it to sweeten our chocolate milk. The kids like to put a little in the bottom of a cup and pour some cold milk into it, or take it out and put fresh warm milk straight from the cow into it. We make a lot of plain yogurt, plain Greek yogurt, and we sweeten it with a little bit of maple syrup. I like the cinnamon and vanilla infused maple syrups to sweeten my coffee. So we have no problem using 6 to 8 gallons of maple syrup in a year. And it just really feels good to have this skill under our belt. Thank you for hanging out with us and learning about making maple syrup. I really do hope that you try it. Please don't let the science behind it intimidate you from trying it, because the only way we learn is by actually doing, or that's the best way I learn. I learn by doing. So thank you. We will see you on Wednesday.